4 years in Dumaguete, and tonight I want to just say the quiet part out loud, the way I haven't quite let myself say it in any of my other videos. I can't go back to America. Not won't, can't. And I think a lot of us out here, women my age especially, are carrying around that exact same realization without ever actually saying it plainly to anyone, including ourselves. So tonight, no Saturday tutoring update, no market trip with Nena, just me being honest with you about the math, the feelings, and everything I've actually come to love here that I don't think I say enough in my other videos. When I got on that plane 4 years ago, I didn't tell myself I was leaving America permanently. I told myself I was going to try it for a year, see if a 68-year-old widow could actually build something real on the other side of the world, and if it didn't work, I'd come home and figure out something else. That was the entire plan. Just see if it fit. And somewhere along the way, without any single dramatic moment I can point back to, that 1 year experiment turned into an entire life. First, it was the coffee shop where Lourdes learned my order. Then it was Nena showing up at my door on a Saturday morning with 2 cups of coffee, assuming I'd come along to the market, whether I'd agreed to it yet or not. Then it was Louisa staying after class to practice a presentation. And somewhere in the middle of all that, without ever sitting down to decide it, I understood that I'd burned the boat, the one I sailed over here on. It's not floating back to Ohio, not really, not in the way that would actually work. I remember the exact evening I actually noticed it, if that makes sense, because it wasn't like there was any particular ceremony marking the moment. Nena and I were sitting on her porch, maybe a year and a half ago now, and she asked me, almost offhandedly, whether I still thought about moving back someday, once I'd had my fill of Dumaguete. And I opened my mouth expecting some easy, reassuring answer to come out, the kind you give without really thinking about it. And instead, what actually came out was, I don't think I could really go back at all anymore, not to stay. Nena didn't seem surprised by that. She just nodded slowly, the way someone does when they've already suspected something for a while and are simply glad to finally hear it said plainly. That was the night I first heard myself admit it out loud, even though it took me another year and a half to actually sit down and make a whole video about it. Let's start with the money, because I think that's the part people are always most curious about and least willing to actually say specific numbers around. And I don't see any reason to be coy about it at my age. My Social Security check comes to a little over $1,600 a month. That's the whole thing. No pension to speak of beyond that, since teaching never came with the kind of retirement package Robert's engineering job would have. Between that check and a very modest amount I still have invested, I'm covering my rent, my groceries, Saturdays with the tutoring program, dinners out with Nena more often than I probably should indulge in, and I'm still setting a little aside most months. That's the entire financial picture. No rounding up to make it sound more impressive than it actually is. Now here's the part I actually sat down and calculated properly, because I wanted real numbers, not just a gut feeling. What would it cost me at 72 years old to actually move back to the United States today? There's no house waiting for me. I sold it 4 years ago, gave away the furniture, and everything I own now fits into this apartment with a view of the Boulevard. So if I went back, I'd be starting from absolute zero. No car, no lease, no furniture. And here's the part that surprised me when I actually looked into it. 4 years away does something to your credit history that I hadn't fully considered before I left. I still have one credit card that never got closed, and I genuinely don't know whether that alone would be enough to get a landlord to take a chance on a 72-year-old woman with 4 years of no verifiable income by American standards. Let's say, though, that somebody did rent to me. I looked up average rent for an ordinary one-bedroom apartment, not anywhere glamorous, just an average American city. And we're talking $1,500 a month for the apartment alone. That's essentially my entire Social Security check gone before I've bought a single grocery, before utilities, before anything else. And I haven't even gotten to needing a car, because unless I landed somewhere genuinely walkable, which most ordinary American towns are not built for, I'd need one. And that means insurance, which I understand has gotten considerably more expensive since I left. By the time I stack rent and a car and insurance on top of that Social Security check, I've spent the whole thing. And I haven't paid for a single doctor's visit yet, haven't bought a birthday gift for a grandchild, haven't done one other ordinary thing a person needs to do to actually live a full life. The math simply does not work. And I haven't even touched on trying to find any kind of part-time work to supplement it, which, let's be honest with each other, a 72-year-old woman who's been out of the American workforce entirely for over a decade, retired even before I left, is not exactly first in line for anybody's hiring consideration. So financially, the door back is essentially closed, at least in any version that resembles the life I actually want at this age. I did run a second version of the math too, just to be fair to myself, the cheapest possible version where I don't try for an ordinary apartment, but instead find a room to rent in someone's house the way a much younger woman might. That version could technically work on paper. The numbers could just barely stretch. But I want to be honest about what that particular life would actually look like day to day, because I don't think the spreadsheet captures the whole picture. It would mean starting over entirely alone at 72 in a town where I don't currently know a single soul, rebuilding an entire social world from nothing at an age when most people are not exactly eager to let a new widow into their already settled friend groups. The technical math might work. The actual lived reality of it does not sound like anything I would genuinely want for whatever years remain to me. I've heard some of you in comments on my other videos use a phrase that I think about often, this idea that there's no real country left for older people in America anymore, not in the way there once was. I don't know if that's true everywhere, and I don't want to make some sweeping claim about an entire country I haven't lived in for 4 years now. But I will say that in my own specific case, at my own specific age, with my own specific fixed income, the math simply did not favor me continuing to try there. And I don't think I'm alone in that particular arithmetic, based on how many of you have said similar things in my comment sections over these past 4 years. But here's the thing, and I want to be honest about this part too, because I think it actually matters more than the money. Even if the math somehow did work out better than it does, even if I found some cheap little room and scraped by the way a much younger version of myself once did, what exactly would I actually be going back to? I want to talk about what I've actually come to love here, because I think in most of my videos, I focus so much on the specific stories, Louisa's scholarship, the storm, my children's visits, that I don't always slow down and just say plainly what it is about this particular life that I wouldn't trade back, even if the math somehow did work out. I love the Boulevard at sunset more than I think I've ever properly expressed in any other video. Nearly every single evening, I walk that same stretch along the water, and the sky does something different every time, orange into violet into a deep blue that I never once saw with that particular intensity back in Ohio. Entire families are out there with me every single evening, teenagers on bicycles, old men playing checkers on an upturned crate, nobody rushing anywhere in particular. I did not understand before I moved here how much I had been missing that specific, ordinary togetherness, people simply existing outside together for no occasion at all. I love that Lourdes at the coffee shop has known my order for 3 years now without me needing to say a word when I walk in. I love that Tonio still waits near the corner most mornings around 8, whether I actually need a ride that day or not, just because he noticed my routine years ago and decided it was worth remembering. I love that Nena shows up at my door most Saturdays holding 2 cups of coffee, entirely uninvited in the technical sense, and entirely expected in every sense that actually matters. I love the Saturday program more than almost anything else in my current life. Watching Louisa grow from a girl who could barely whisper her answers into a young woman who earned a scholarship to study education herself that has given me a version of purpose I genuinely did not expect to feel again at my age, having believed for a while after Robert died that my most useful years were simply behind me. They weren't. They were just waiting somewhere I hadn't thought to look yet. I love too, and I don't think I say this enough, how genuinely unafraid I feel here about growing older. Back home, I think there's a particular fear that settles into you as you age, a fear of becoming a burden, a fear of the specific isolation that seems to swallow up so many elderly Americans once their children's lives get busy and their own mobility starts to limit them. I don't feel that fear here, or at least nowhere near as sharply. When I had that chest pain scare a while back, it was Nena who got me to the hospital within 20 minutes, and it was half the neighborhood practically who came by over the following days to check on me. I have never once in 4 years here felt like an inconvenience to the people around me. I felt that constantly toward the end of my time in Ohio, even when nobody said it outright. Here, nobody's ever made me feel it at all. The healthcare itself deserves its own mention because I think it surprises people every single time I bring it up. That chest pain scare, the full workup, the EKG, the consultation came to under $35. I sat in that hospital afterward doing the kind of disbelieving math I imagine every American who moves here eventually does, thinking about what that same visit would have cost me back home, even with Medicare covering a portion of it. It's not just that it's cheaper. The doctor sat with me for as long as I actually needed, unhurried, in a way I hadn't experienced from an American physician in years before I left. I think about a friend back in Ohio, a woman named Carol I'd known for over 20 years, who mentioned to me once on a phone call that she'd waited nearly 6 weeks just to get a routine appointment with her own primary care doctor, and even then had been given barely 10 minutes before being ushered back out to the waiting room for the next patient. I don't say this to criticize the entire American healthcare system, since I understand there are excellent doctors and excellent hospitals there too. I only mean to say that the specific experience I've had here, unhurried, attentive, and remarkably affordable all at once, is not something I take for granted, and it's a genuine factor, alongside everything else, in why going back doesn't appeal to me the way it might have once, when I was younger and healthier, and less likely to need that kind of unhurried attention in the first place. I love the food here more than I ever expected to, if I'm honest. Something I don't think comes across enough in my other videos where I'm usually focused on the people rather than the meals themselves. The Humbafi makes at her little carinderia this rich, sweet braised pork that I genuinely dream about some nights. The fresh mango from the market, still slightly warm from the sun, sweeter than anything I ever bought at an Ohio grocery store in my entire life. Even the halo, that strange, wonderful mix of shaved ice and beans and fruit and purple ice cream that I thought looked utterly absurd the first time someone handed me a bowl of it, and that I now genuinely crave on hot afternoons. I know some of you watching this are going to comment asking whether I get lonely here, especially given everything else I've said tonight about the in-between feeling. So let me address that directly instead of leaving it for the comment section to wonder about. I do get lonely sometimes. I won't pretend otherwise. There are evenings I miss my children and grandchildren with an ache that catches me off guard, usually around the holidays, or when I see a video someone's posted of a birthday I wasn't present for. But I want to be honest that the specific loneliness I feel here now is genuinely different from the loneliness I felt in my final years in Ohio, in the months after Robert died, sitting in a house that had become far too large and far too quiet for one person. That loneliness back then felt total, unbroken by anyone actually checking on me day to day. This loneliness, when it does arrive here, arrives inside a life that is otherwise genuinely full of people who would notice immediately if I disappeared. Those are two very different kinds of lonely, and I don't think it's fair to either one to pretend they're the same feeling. Let me address a couple of the other comments I know are coming too. The way I've seen other people out here do in their own videos. I know somebody's going to ask why I still pay into Medicare Part B if I'm not even living somewhere I can use it regularly. Fair question, and the honest answer is the same one a lot of us give. If I ever need to fly back for something serious, or if I ever do end up returning permanently, for whatever reason, dropping that coverage now means a penalty that follows me the rest of my life if I ever try to pick it back up. So I keep paying into something I mostly don't use, the same way you keep insurance on a house through all the years nothing burns down, just in case the one bad day arrives. And I know somebody's going to tell me the grass is always greener, that I clearly have a good life here and should simply be grateful instead of talking about being unable to go back. And they're not wrong exactly. I do have a good life here, genuinely, more so in many ways than I had in my final years in Ohio. But I don't think being grateful for where I landed and being honest about the fact that the door home has mostly closed behind me are actually in conflict with each other. Both things are true at the same time. I can watch that sunset over the boulevard most evenings feeling genuinely at peace and still sit here tonight telling you honestly that going back in any meaningful sense simply isn't realistic for me anymore. I've noticed this same comment on other women's channels too, the ones making videos somewhat like this one, and every time somebody tells them to simply be grateful and stop overthinking it, I notice the woman making the video usually agrees completely and keeps making the video anyway. I think that's because gratitude and honesty were never actually competing with each other the way that particular comment assumes. I am grateful every single day for Nena and Faye and Lourdes and Louisa and this entire life I fell into almost without meaning to. And I still think it's worth saying plainly, once out loud, that the reason I'm grateful for it isn't that I chose it freely over some equally available alternative back home. It's that the alternative back home mostly stopped being available somewhere along the way. And I only truly noticed once I sat down and calculated it properly instead of simply assuming it was still sitting there waiting for me. I think about my children in all this too, Rachel and Kevin. They both came to visit separately, and I think they both understood by the end of those visits that I had built something genuinely real here, rather than simply run away from something back home. But I also know that neither of them fully experiences the particular in-between feeling I'm describing tonight, because they still have a country in the full sense of the word. Their slot back home is still exactly where they left it. When Rachel calls me, she's calling from inside a country I used to fully belong to, into whatever this in-between place is that I live in now. I don't say that with any bitterness toward either of them. I just think it's worth naming honestly that the distance between us these days isn't only geography, it's that they still have a homeland in the complete sense, and I'm not entirely sure I do anymore, in either direction. I think too about my grandchildren specifically, since I know that's usually the first question anyone asks a grandmother who's moved this far away. I miss ordinary moments with them more than almost anything else, the small, unremarkable Tuesday afternoons I don't get to be part of anymore, a school project, a first day of a new grade, the little things that don't feel significant enough to schedule a video call around, but that add up over years into an entire childhood I'm only watching from a distance. That particular ache hasn't gone away in 4 years, and I don't expect it ever fully will. But I've also come to understand that the alternative, staying in Ohio simply to be geographically closer while otherwise slowly disappearing into loneliness and diminishing purpose, would not actually have served them either, not in any way that mattered beyond simple proximity on a map. I don't want anyone watching this to think I've grown bitter toward America, because that's not where I'm sitting at all. I loved my life there. I loved 31 years in that school library, watching children grow up and come back years later, still remembering my name. I loved Robert and our house and 43 years of an ordinary good marriage. I'm not running from any of that in my heart, even if I'm no longer living inside it. And I love plenty about this country too now. The patience, the way Nena and Faye and Angeline folded me in without ever making any particular fuss about it. The specific, unhurried warmth of an entire town simply existing together most evenings. But if I'm being completely honest with you, I don't think I fully belong here either, not in the deepest sense. I'm the woman who arrived one September with 2 suitcases, welcomed, genuinely, warmly, but not entirely woven in, and probably never completely. Not in the way Nena or Faye belong here by simple birthright. I don't hate carrying that particular in-between feeling anymore, the way I think I might have when it first became clear to me, maybe a year or so into living here. I've made a kind of peace with it. I am not fully American in the daily, lived sense anymore, and I will never be fully Filipino, not really, no matter how many years I stay or how many words of Cebuano I eventually learn to say without stumbling. I exist somewhere in between those two things now, and for a long while I thought that in-between space would feel like a loss. Most days now, it just feels like where I actually live, and I've stopped needing it to be anything tidier than that. I think about how many years I likely have left too, more than I probably should at my age, if I'm honest. My own mother lived to 89. My father made it to 76. So maybe I've got somewhere between 10 and 20 years ahead of me, if I'm fortunate and reasonably careful. That is not an unlimited amount of time. It's a specific, countable number of years, and I keep landing on the same question whenever I turn it over. Do I want to spend a meaningful portion of whatever years remain fighting to rebuild a version of American life that financially and otherwise doesn't currently have much room left for a woman in my exact position? Or do I want to spend those years on a boulevard at sunset, at a Saturday program with a room full of children who greet me like my presence genuinely matters, in a life that, however unplanned, has turned out to actually fit me. I think too about the specific women I've watched navigate this exact same math differently than I have. Women in my own Facebook group who went back after a year or two, unable to sustain the distance from family the way I've managed to. I don't judge any of them for that choice, not even slightly. Every single one of us is running our own particular equation, weighing our own specific relationships and resources and fears, and there is no single correct answer that applies equally to every woman facing this decision. I only know my own answer, arrived at honestly after 4 years of actually living inside it, rather than simply theorizing about it from the outside. When I frame it in terms of actual years, instead of some abstract sense of loyalty to where I came from, the answer gets considerably less complicated than it feels when you're simply turning it over as an unresolved question of pride. 10 to 20 years is not nothing. I don't want to spend a meaningful fraction of them proving a point to nobody in particular about which country a woman is supposed to grow old inside of. If you're sitting somewhere right now, turning this exact same question over yourself, wondering whether your own numbers work, wondering whether there's still a place for you back home, or whether that place has quietly closed while you weren't watching closely, I'm not going to tell you what to do because I don't know your specific circumstances, your family, your particular version of what's actually waiting on either side of that decision. All I can offer you is my own honest math and my own honest answer, arrived at more slowly and more reluctantly than I probably should have taken to get there. What I would say, if you're early enough in considering something like this that you haven't yet sold the house and given away the furniture, is do the real math before you get on the plane, not 4 years afterward the way I mostly ended up doing it. Figure out plainly what your actual fixed income covers wherever you're considering, and separately, honestly, what it would genuinely take to rebuild if you ever needed to return. Don't assume, the way I did without quite realizing I was assuming it, that the option to simply go back will always still be sitting there waiting for you exactly as you left it. And if you're already past that point, if you've already done what I did and built an entire life here before ever running these particular numbers, I don't think there's anything wrong with simply naming it plainly the way I'm doing tonight, rather than quietly pretending the door home remains wide open when the actual math says otherwise. There's a specific kind of relief in saying the true thing out loud instead of carrying around the polite, unexamined version of it. I felt lighter after admitting this to Nena over coffee one Saturday morning than I had in months. And I think that conversation is part of why I finally sat down to record this particular video instead of simply continuing on with my usual updates. Most evenings, I'm still walking that same stretch of the boulevard as the sky turns from orange to violet. The same walk I took that very first week here, uncertain then whether I'd made a terrible mistake. Most Saturdays, I'm still in that church basement with a room full of children who expect me, who greet me like my showing up genuinely matters to their week. That's not the life I planned for myself back when Robert and I still had our whole future mapped out together in Ohio. But it's the actual life in front of me now, filled with real people who would notice immediately if I didn't show up one evening. And I've decided, after turning this over more nights than I probably needed to, that this matters considerably more than which country's passport happens to be sitting in my drawer. I keep coming back to this question of what's actually enough, because I think that's the real thing underneath all the money talk and all the belonging talk tonight. Enough was never going to mean the exact life Robert and I built together in Ohio. That life ended the day he did, regardless of which country I eventually chose to keep living in afterward. So the real question was never whether I could somehow rebuild that precise original life. It was whether I could build something that genuinely felt like enough, on whatever terms were actually available to a 68-year-old widow with a modest pension. And it turns out the answer to that was yes, just not anywhere I would have guessed beforehand, and not in a shape I would have originally sketched out for myself. If this one felt different from my usual videos, let me know down in the comments. Tell me whether you're sitting in this same particular in-between place I'm describing tonight, or whether your own math is working out entirely differently. I read every single comment, even the ones that push back on me, and I genuinely like to hear where you stand. Thank you for sitting through the honest version tonight instead of my usual Saturday update. I'll see you in the next one.